In a single night, more than 20 drones swarm toward Sevastopol, home port of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. They don't hit the ships. They hit something more valuable. The radar arrays the eyes of the fleet. A navy that can no longer see is a navy that can only hope it doesn't get hit. And that is exactly the plan. But this plan has almost nothing to do with the ships. What's happening in that sky over Sevastopol is only the first step. The real attack isn't aimed at the fleet. It's aimed at something far bigger, an entire peninsula. And at a question nobody in Moscow says out loud: how long can a fortress survive when no one storms it? But nothing gets in either. To understand what's happening here, we need to pull the picture back for a second. Crimea has never been just a piece of land for Russia. It's the crown jewel, the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Black Sea, the platform from which Moscow meant to control half the region. When Russia seized the peninsula in 2014, the Kremlin had exactly one great fear: that this jewel ultimately hangs by a thin thread. Because Crimea is an island in almost everything that matters. It connects to the mainland like a house reachable by a single driveway. So Russia built that driveway. 19 kilometers of concrete and steel across the Kerch Strait, the most expensive bridge the country has ever built. It was meant to be the backbone. Tanks would roll across it, fuel would flow, ammunition would come. As long as the bridge held, so went the promise Crimea was Russian forever. And Russia didn't just build a bridge. Between 2014 and 2022, by some estimates, around $15 billion poured into Crimea, a new highway across the peninsula, thermal power plants, wells, ports, rail lines. Moscow wanted to turn the vulnerable island into a self-sufficient fortress that no one could squeeze anymore. On paper, that's exactly what happened. But all that concrete has one blind spot: that no amount of money can close energy. You can't pump fuel out of the ground in Crimea. It has to come from outside across exactly the few arteries that are now under fire. Hold on to that sentence because it's the key to everything that follows. Picture the peninsula for a moment as a besieged castle from the Middle Ages. High walls, deep moats, a garrison of tens of thousands plus 2 million people living inside. For centuries, siege warfare ran on one simple rule: whoever wanted the castle had to storm the walls and bleed doing it. The defenders inside held every advantage. They sat safe behind the stone. But there was always a second way to take a castle. The quieter one. You don't storm. You wait. You cut the roads that bring in food, water, and supplies. And then you let the walls do the work for you against the people locked behind them. No ladder, no battering ram. Just patience and hunger. That's the story of Crimea in 2026. Russia has turned the peninsula into one of the most heavily fortified zones in Europe. Concrete dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, minefields, trench lines to the horizon, all built to smash a Ukrainian landing. And Ukraine looked at all of it and decided never to come ashore. That's the heart of it, and at first it sounds like a contradiction. Ukraine isn't trying to retake Crimea by sending soldiers across the water. It's trying to do it by slowly cutting off the peninsula's air. No assault boats on the beaches, no paratroopers in the sky. Instead, drones hunting for radar, missiles hunting for bridges, and a patient cold pressure on every single supply line that keeps this fortress alive. Because a fortress is only as strong as the supplies that reach it. Take the supplies away, and the strongest castle in the world becomes what Crimea is now, in danger of becoming a giant prison with its own army locked inside. There's a deliberate choice behind this, and it says a lot about how Ukraine thinks. Instead of sending young men into a frontal assault on fortified beaches and losing them there by the thousands, Kyiv is betting on effect over mass. Don't take the ground. Produce the effect. Don't shoot the defender. Take away the fuel he fights with. It's a cold, almost accountant-like way to wage war, but it spares your own blood and still forces the bill onto the enemy. And here's the part almost nobody is watching. The drones over Sevastopol, the destroyed ferries, the burning fuel trucks taken one by one. Each of these strikes looks like just another attack in a long war. But stack them on top of each other and a single number appears. A number nobody in Moscow says out loud. And on the day that number reaches zero, the Russian presence on this peninsula ends without a single Ukrainian soldier stepping onto the beach. What that number is and why it's ticking, we'll get to in a moment. Because it's the whole story. Keep it in your head. Let's start with the eyes. A modern air defense is only as good as what it can see. Radar is basically a pair of eyes staring into the dark, sounding the alarm the moment something approaches. Take that sight away from the defense, and even the most expensive missiles in the world fire into empty air. That's exactly where Ukraine went to work. In March 2026, Ukrainian drones struck a facility in Sevastopol called Granite. That's no random target. According to Ukrainian sources and the Telegram channel, Crimean Wind Granite is the workshop where the Black Sea Fleet's air defense systems are maintained and repaired, run by the Russian defense conglomerate Almazante. Eyewitnesses reported at least 5 drones hitting the building. In the same stretch, Ukrainian military intelligence said it had struck the most advanced radar Russia uses against small drones, the Valdai system, and jammed satellite navigation on top of it. Read that again. Not the ships. The workshop for the eyes. The radar meant to detect small drones. Whoever destroys the repair shop for the air defense doesn't take away one weapon from the enemy, he takes away the ability to make all of his weapons combat-ready again. And it didn't stop at one strike. Over weeks from January into the spring of 2026, Ukraine dismantled Russia's air defense over Crimea piece by piece. In April, drones and Ukrainian intelligence special forces hit the Sevastopol naval base, again landing ships, the reconnaissance vessel Ivan Kerch, and once more radar and air defense infrastructure, including a radar station of the MESAM-1 type. In the same period, 2 Russian landing ships were heavily damaged in Sevastopol Bay, and Ukraine additionally struck the Belbek military airfield in Crimea with a MiG-31 interceptor among the targets. In late May, a Storm Shadow cruise missile followed, aimed at the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet's naval aviation. The original fleet headquarters had already been hit so badly, back in 2023, that Russia began tearing down the ruin in early 2026. And the eerie part is the price. We're not just talking about cruise missiles worth millions. We're largely talking about small, cheap drones models like the UJ-26, which Ukrainians call the Beaver, or the growing fleet of so-called Hornet drones. They cost a fraction of what a single Russian air defense system is worth. And the more brigades that field them, the clearer it becomes. Production is ramping up, and this pressure won't ease anytime soon. That's the real revolution in this story. Something that costs a few $1,000s hunts something that costs hundreds of millions and wins. That's also why the famous name Black Sea Fleet is almost a memory today. Russia pulled most of its fleet out of Sevastopol long ago into the port of Novorossiysk on the Russian coast. By estimates, that fleet has lost roughly half its tonnage and about a third of its warships since the start of the invasion. The proudest fleet of the Black Sea cleared out of its own home port because it was no longer safe. A navy that flees its own base says more about the course of the war than any statistic. But even the fallback port is no longer a safe place. In the spring of 2026, Ukrainian sea drones, small remote-controlled boats of the Magura type packed with explosives, ran right up to the entrance of Novorossiysk and damaged tankers there within sight of the Russian coast. A fleet that fled Sevastopol to be safe is now being hunted in its new home too. For these ships, there's simply no quiet harbor left in the Black Sea. So much for the eyes. Now the lifeline. Remember the Kerch Bridge, the backbone, the promise. Today, Russia doesn't even dare run heavy fuel trains across it. According to an advisor to the Russian-installed Crimea administration, fuel isn't transported across the bridge for safety reasons. Let that sink. In the most expensive structure in the country built to guarantee exactly this supply has become too dangerous for its most important cargo. What was built as an indestructible artery has become the single biggest weak point on the whole peninsula. On one night in mid-May, Russia reported more than 150 drones over its regions and Crimea. The Kerch Bridge was closed for about 11 hours, and 12 passenger trains were left stranded. And after the destruction of the rail ferries, Russia even started running dangerous cargo across the very bridge it considers safety critical. When you haul flammable loads over a target that's constantly under drone alert, that's not a plan anymore. That's a last resort. That leaves the emergency exit, the ferries. Across the Kerch Strait ran ferries that could carry fuel, the Conroe Trader, the Avangard, the Slavyanin. Between 2024 and 2026, Ukraine attacked them. According to Russian sources, all 3 are currently out of service. Restoration may be possible no sooner than around September. The remaining car ferries are hopelessly overloaded. The wait stretches to 5 days. And the rail ferry, which could move heavy rail cars, is by several accounts simply not operating. Even storage has become a problem. Private traders refuse to stockpile fuel in Crimea because the depots are attacked regularly, and insurers won't touch it. A reserve no one will safely store anymore is a reserve that shrinks. What does an army do when you take away its bridge, its ferries, and its railway? It gets creative and desperate. The spokesman for the Ukrainian Navy. Dmytro Pletenchuk described how the Russian military has resorted to disguising heavy fuel trucks as civilian vehicles as milk or food trucks to slip across the land corridor unnoticed. Picture that a great power has to smuggle its fuel in milk trucks so a cheap drone won't find it. Because the third route, the land corridor, is no safe harbor anymore either. That roughly 700-kilometer route runs from Russia through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol up into northern Crimea. For years, it was Moscow's solution to the bridge problem. Russia saw this coming and built against it. Reuters reported that Moscow poured roughly $12 billion between 2024 and 2026 into roads, rail lines, and ports across the occupied territories, including a highway ring around the Sea of Azov meant to connect Crimea with the Donbas in southern Russia. The idea, a network with no single point of failure, one you can't shut down with a single strike. But a network that runs everywhere can also be hit everywhere. Ukrainian drones hunt fuel trucks along these routes on purpose. According to reporting by Meduza and RFE/RL, a fuel crisis has broken out at gas stations in Crimea. Sales were capped at 20 liters per driver per day, and many stations are simply empty. People put their names on waiting lists for gasoline. Hubs like the Jankoy rail station in northern Crimea have been hit repeatedly. Passenger service there no longer runs at night, and there have been reports of dead and wounded on commuter trains. In early June, Russia even suspended rail service to Crimea entirely after a Ukrainian drone knocked out a locomotive. And even the Russian-installed authorities in the south now talk openly about a comprehensive remote mining system drones that drop explosives set to detonate on movement, paralyzing traffic on the corridor. In early June, the Russian-installed authorities additionally ordered restrictions on passenger and freight traffic on the major roads leading into the region, a quiet admission that even the supposedly safe land route has turned dangerous. Russian sources now speak openly of a dead zone along the front, a strip where drones hit practically anything that moves. Picture a road where every truck has to assume it'll be spotted and struck before it reaches its destination. That's what resupply looks like for Russia in the south today. Ukraine's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov calls what's happening here a logistics lockdown. Not a single big maneuver, no tank battle, just 1,000 small cuts to every artery at once. And now we come to the number. A siege in the 21st century no longer looks the way it used to. No house-to-house fighting, no ladders on the walls. At its core, it's arithmetic. On one side is how much fuel, ammunition, and water comes into the fortress each day. On the other side is how much gets used up each day. As long as more comes in than gets consumed, the fortress lives. The moment the scale tips, a clock starts running. Ukraine stopped throwing itself at the walls. It started working on that equation. Every destroyed ferry lowers what comes in. Every fuel truck taken out lowers what comes in. Every blinded radar station makes the next strike cheaper and safer and lowers what comes in all over again. It's a loop that feeds itself. That's exactly what makes this phase of the war different from everything before it. Earlier, Ukraine struck individual targets deep inside Russia. Now it's working on a system, and every hit makes the next one easier. And the consumption side. That can't be switched off. Tens of thousands of soldiers, aircraft, air defense systems, ships, generators, they all burn fuel whether anyone is fighting or not. A modern garrison idling is still a garrison consuming. That's the trap. Those same tens of thousands of men behind their dragon's teeth meant to be a source of strength are nothing in this equation, but a huge number on the consumption side. Every soldier is a mouth that has to be supplied across a bridge that's too dangerous and over ferries that don't run. That's the uncomfortable truth behind Crimea's concrete walls. Russia's fortifications protect against an attack that never comes. Against what's actually happening, the slow drying up of supply dragon's teeth and anti-tank ditches are utterly useless. You can't fill an empty tank with a minefield. Strength on the map, weakness in reality. Remember the 15 billion Russia poured into Crimea. Here's why it doesn't solve the problem. You can build power plants and drill wells all you want, but you can't manufacture fuel. A fortress that has to import its energy is only ever as free as its supply lines. And those are exactly what Ukraine has taken hold of. Now to the number nobody in Moscow says out loud. It's called reserve. How many days can Crimea live off its own stockpiles? If nothing more comes in, the Ukrainian Navy itself admits Russia still has certain fuel reserves on the peninsula. But reserves are finite. They're a tank draining down and no one holds the hose anymore. And here's where I lay my cards on the table. This is an assessment, not a fact set in stone. If the bridge no longer carries heavy fuel cars, if the ferries are sitting on the bottom of the sea and the land corridor is under constant fire, then all that's left is what's already on the island. By cautious estimates of the kind that circulate in analyses like these, a garrison cut off, like that might last on the order of 30 days before fuel and ammunition turn critical, before aircraft stay grounded because there's no kerosene, and ships stay in port because there's no diesel. 30 days isn't a prophecy with a date. It's an order of magnitude, but it points the direction a fortress that's cut off doesn't die in a storm. It starves on a calendar, and this slow drying up has a face. A pilot who doesn't take off because the kerosene is rationed. An air defense soldier whose radar needs repair but the workshop lies in rubble. A captain whose ship stays at the pier because the diesel for the next run isn't there. None of them is beaten in a battle. They're beaten by a spreadsheet, by a column where the numbers get a little smaller every day. And while the military arithmetic runs a second quieter, one runs alongside it. Crimea had a chronic problem even before this war water. Since 2014, the North Crimean Canal, which brought fresh water from mainland Ukraine, has been largely dead for the peninsula. Russia has countered with wells and cloud seeding, but the reserves are shrinking. According to monitoring groups, clean water in Crimea is increasingly becoming a privilege. First for the military, the security services, and the businesses of the elite. For ordinary people, what's left is scarcity and waiting. Set that next to the fuel crisis, and the picture gets clear. When the diesel that runs the emergency generators and pumps starts to run short, two separate problems become one. A peninsula that hangs on both fuel and water at the same time is a peninsula on a very short thread. And this pressure doesn't only hit barracks. Crimea was supposed to be a vacation paradise again this summer, sun, sea, sand. Instead, tourists and locals stand in the same lines in front of empty gas stations. An economy that lives on tourism but can't give its guests gasoline is sawing off the branch the whole occupation sits on. Economic pressure and military pressure have become the same thing here. That's why the 20 drones over Sevastopol from the beginning were never really about the ships. They were the first cut of many. Whoever blinds the eyes of the defense makes every further strike against the bridge, the ferry, and the fuel truck a little safer. And every one of those strikes pushes the same number a little closer to zero. How does this end? Honestly, several paths are open, and no one should pretend to know the date. But you can rank the probabilities. The first scenario is the slow chokehold. No dramatic collapse, no white flag over Sevastopol. Instead, a Crimea that hollows out from the inside militarily. Aircraft that take off less often, ships that stay in port. Air defense that's still standing but blind and running on fumes. A garrison that still exists but can barely fight anymore because every leader is rationed. From where we stand today, that's the most likely path, and the reason is simple. It's already happening. Fuel is rationed, trains are stopped, ferries lie idle. You don't have to invent a future. You only have to extend the present. That's exactly what makes this scenario so dangerous for Moscow. It doesn't require a single new Ukrainian breakthrough. It only requires that everything keeps going the way it is now. The second scenario is repair. Russia gets the ferries running again by September, builds, as discussed, a pipeline over or under the Strait scales. Up the disguised convoys, finds new ways across the land corridor. That's possible. Russia is inventive under pressure, and it has already pumped billions into exactly these kinds of solutions. But every one of these escape routes has the same design flaw. It becomes the next target itself. A new pipeline is a new thing you can hit. A repaired ferry is a repaired ferry you can sink again. As long as Ukraine has the drones and missiles to reach this artery, every repair is only a breather, not a cure. An honest look belongs here too. This advantage isn't built to last forever. Over time, Russia will develop countermeasures, better jammers, denser defenses, new routes. That's exactly why this moment matters. Ukraine has a window in which cheap drones overwhelm expensive Russian logistics, and it knows that window can close again at some point. Whoever wants to starve a fortress has to do it while the hunger works faster than the adaptation. The third scenario is a ceasefire and a freezing of the front that leaves Crimea formally with Russia. But even then, the problem doesn't disappear. A peninsula whose only bridge stays within reach of Ukrainian strikes is permanently blackmailable. As long as Kyiv keeps the ability to reach the bridge and the ferries, it holds a lever. No negotiation simply wipes away. Crimea's vulnerability isn't healed by a signature. It's only frozen. If I have to commit, I'll commit to the first scenario, slow starvation, rather than a big bang. But every honest prediction also has to say what would prove it wrong. Here's my exit condition the moment I admit I was wrong. If Russia gets the 3 fuel ferries operating again, resecures the land corridor, and the lines at Crimea's gas stations disappear, then the arithmetic doesn't hold, and the fortress breathes again. Watch the gas stations. Watch the ferries. They're the most honest thermometer of this entire war. No one is going to take Crimea back with flags on the beaches. If this story ends, it ends quietly with a tanker that doesn't arrive, a ferry that doesn't sail, and a number that eventually reaches 0. A fortress doesn't always die in a storm. Sometimes it starves on a calendar while its walls stand flawless to the very end. If I'm right, you'll see the signs before anyone officially admits them. Longer lines at the gas stations, more disguised convoys, a ferry repair that slips past September units quietly rotating off the peninsula. Keep your eye on the number. Share this video with someone who actually wants to understand the map, and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown when that number moves. One last question remains, and it's bigger than Crimea. What does it mean for every fortress in the world if a handful of cheap drones can starve out an entire peninsula without ever coming ashore?